Take away the police, not as a thought experiment, as a fact. No number to call, no patrol car that might be nearby, no constable, no badge, no institution with the authority to arrest the man who just killed your brother in the street outside your house. There is no one coming. What do you do? For most of human history, the answer was the same everywhere. You gathered your family. You went to find his. Before there were police, the only currency that could stop a killing was a price placed on the dead man's life. That price had a name, and understanding what that name meant, and who got to set the price, and who was excluded from the negotiation entirely, tells you almost everything about what justice actually looked like for the 3,000 years before Robert Peel put 1,000 men in blue uniforms on the streets of London in 1829. The system that existed before that moment was not chaos. It was something more precise than chaos, and in some ways more honest. It was a set of rules built around a single premise that the only person with the right and the obligation to enforce the law was the person the law had failed. You were your own detective. You were your own prosecutor. You were your own enforcer. And if you were lucky, you were also part of a family large enough and feared enough that the man on the other side of the dispute would think twice. If you were not lucky, the system had nothing for you. That is where this story begins. The technical name for what existed across the ancient world, from Germanic tribes to biblical Israel to early Iceland, is kin policing. The family was the enforcement unit. When a wrong was committed against you, your kin had both the right and the obligation to respond. Not a suggestion, an obligation. Picture a village in post-Roman Germania, sometime in the 5th century. A man is dead in the dirt outside his door. His brother stands over the body. There is no magistrate in this place, no constable, no court with a calendar and a procedure. There is only the brother, and across the valley, the family of the man who did this. What happens next is not a riot. It is a process. The process had rules. The Roman historian Tacitus documented the customs of the Germanic tribes in his work Germania, written around 98 AD, and what he described was not lawlessness. It was a competing legal order. You could target the offender. You could not kill his innocent neighbor. Women, small children, and older men were excluded from direct violence. The kinship group that supported you also policed you, because indiscriminate killing by your own side could force your entire family into a war they had not chosen. Encyclopedia.com's documentation of early medieval legal procedure describes the constraint explicitly. A kinship group both supported its aggrieved members and limited them, because the cost of uncontrolled escalation fell on everyone in the family. In the Book of Judges, Gideon captures members of the Midianite tribe who had killed his brothers and executes them personally. The account is presented not as revenge, but as legitimate justice, because in that social order, it was. The blood feud was, as legal historians at the Abdurrahman Boroman Center have documented, the critical mechanism for restricting violence in a society without police or prosecutors. Its logic was deterrence. If harming your neighbor meant that your entire family answered for it, you thought carefully before harming your neighbor. That deterrence was real. In tight communities of known families, it worked. A man contemplating violence against his neighbor knew the cost. The threat was credible because it was personal and it was collective. It was also catastrophic when it failed. Stephen White, whose research on violence in the Touraine region around 1100 AD is documented in academic literature on early medieval Francia, found that aggrieved parties routinely delayed or rejected compensation, prolonging feuds strategically. A feud that began with a single killing could run for 2 or 3 generations, consuming both families. The dead body restored honor. It could not buy seed and livestock for the coming winter. Both families understood this and continued anyway, because the community's awareness that you had suffered a wrong and had the right to avenge it was itself a form of social capital, and some families could not afford to spend it cheaply. But the second failure mode was quieter and more permanent. Kin policing required you to have kin, powerful kin. It required the other family to fear yours. The poor had no powerful kin. Strangers in a new place had no network at all. Women could not fight and were not expected to. For them, the system was not failing. It was functioning exactly as designed. It had simply been designed around someone else. Ancient Israel, Germanic tribes, early Iceland, and tribal societies in the Americas all independently arrived at the blood feud model without contact with each other. That convergence is not coincidence. It is the only logical answer when there is no third-party enforcer. And in every version of it, across every civilization that developed it independently, the system drew the same circle. Inside the circle were the people the law protected. Outside it were everyone else. Which is why, sometime around the 8th and 9th centuries in Anglo-Saxon England, the men who administered the law began working on a different answer. They called it weregild, the price of a man. Weregild was the attempt to convert violence into negotiation. If you killed a man, you owed his family a payment scaled to his social rank. A free farmer's life had a specific price, measured in cattle and silver. A nobleman's weregild was substantially higher. A slave's weregild was near zero. The law did not pretend that all lives were equal. It assigned different monetary values to different human beings, openly and with precision. And it built an entire legal order on top of that assignment. The mechanism worked like this. A crime occurred. The offender's family and the victim's family entered negotiation, mediated by community elders. If the weregild was paid, the matter was formally closed. The feud was over. The money served, as Encyclopedia.com's documentation of the period explains, as proof that the dead man's kin had acted correctly by defending him, and that the offending family had acknowledged the wrong. Reconciliation was often marked by a communal meal. The community witnessed both the payment and the closure. The cycle stopped. King Aethelstan, who ruled England from roughly 924 to 939 AD, went further. He codified a system called the Frank Pledge. Every free male over the age of 12 was enrolled in a tithing, a group of 10 households bound together by mutual surety. The group was collectively responsible for the conduct of each of its members. If one man in your tithing committed a crime and fled, the remaining 9 paid his fine. The incentive to police your neighbors was not altruism. It was survival. Stand in a field in Anglo-Saxon England around 930 AD. You are one of 10 men. You have taken an oath. The man beside you is not your friend. He is your financial obligation. If he steals from the village across the hill, you will pay for it. You watch him more carefully than you watch your own family, because your family's conduct you can control. His is the uncertainty you cannot afford. When a crime was witnessed, the victim or witness raised the hue and cry, a formal shout that obligated every able-bodied person within earshot, aged 15 to 60, to drop what they were doing and join the pursuit. Failure to respond carried a fine. The Statute of Winchester, passed in 1285, formalized these obligations into statute, and it remained the primary legislation governing policing in England until 1829, a span of 544 years. The hue and cry was not a medieval curiosity, it was the law of England for more than half a millennium. In the stable rural communities where it was designed to operate, the system had genuine reach. A thief who ran was chased by dozens. A killer known to his village faced the collective memory of everyone who had witnessed the deed. The Frank Pledge turned every neighbor into a constable with a personal financial stake in local order. But Wergild carried its deepest flaw inside its own logic. The accused could gather oath helpers, documented members of his community, who would stand beside him in front of the Shire Reeve and swear to his innocence. If he brought enough of them, he walked. Encyclopedia.com's account of early medieval legal procedure is explicit on this. The accused man's social network was his defense. A man with powerful friends and many oath helpers was far harder to convict than a man without them, regardless of what either man had actually done. Justice was not blind. It looked directly at the number of people you had brought with you and made its calculation accordingly. And Wergild itself was not universal protection. It was protection for the connected. A slave's Wergild was near zero, not because the law considered slaves unimportant in some abstract sense, but because the law was written by men who owned slaves and assigned legal value according to social utility. A noblewoman's Wergild was substantial, but legal historians have noted that this price was not the value of her life. It was the price of insulting her male kin. Harming her was an offense against them. Her Wergild was compensation to her family for the damage to their honor, not acknowledgement of her individual worth. That distinction is not a footnote to the system. It is the architecture. The Frank Pledge also presupposed permanence. You had to know the 10 men in your tithing. They had to know you. As English towns grew, as people moved, as strangers arrived with no tithing assignment, the mechanism had nothing to offer them. The hue and cry required neighbors willing to run together. In a city, you did not know your neighbors. You had no idea whether the man being chased down the street was guilty of anything. The shout in the dark was not a legal summons. It was noise. Something was about to fill that gap. And what filled it was, for a time, worse than the gap itself. By the early 18th century, London's population was approaching 1 million people in a relatively confined area. The tithing system had long since ceased to function in the city's expanding streets. Parish constables, unpaid and part-time, were widely regarded as ineffective and frequently corrupt. The Bow Street Runners, established by the magistrate Henry Fielding in 1742, provided a small semi-professional detection unit. But they were limited in number and jurisdiction. What remained, in the space between a victim and justice, was a private market. A woman wakes in London in 1718 to find her silver candlesticks gone. There is one option. She goes to a man named Jonathan Wild, who keeps a public office near the Old Bailey. She pays him a fee. She does not ask where the candlesticks went. She does not ask how he will find them. She knows at some level that the answer to both questions is the same man sitting across the desk from her. The thief-taker system emerged from a 1697 Act of Parliament that offered £40 for the capture and successful prosecution of a highway robber, roughly 2 years' wages for a laborer. That bounty created a profession. Private individuals, thief-takers, recovered stolen property and arrested criminals for reward. They filled the vacuum left by the parish constables and the collapsed Frank Pledge. Operating through personal networks in London's criminal underworld and leveraging those networks to negotiate the return of goods or betray thieves to magistrates. Jonathan Wild was the most successful thief-taker London produced. By the early 1720s, he had returned hundreds of stolen items to their owners, collected substantial fees, and had at least 60 people hanged at Tyburn. The government consulted him on criminal matters. The newspapers praised his civic contribution. He was also running the thieves himself. Wild organized the burglaries, fenced the goods through intermediaries, then charged the victims a fee to recover property he had arranged to have taken. If a thief in his network tried to operate independently, Wild had him arrested and collected the 40-pound bounty. He called himself the Thief-Taker General of England and Ireland. He is said to have inspired the term double cross for the 2 marks he placed in his ledger beside the names of men he had decided to betray. He was hanged at Tyburn in May 1725 after conviction for perverting justice. The crowd that gathered to watch was described as one of the largest London had ever produced for an execution. They threw things, but his death resolved nothing structural. Wilde was not an anomaly. He was the system's logical product. The thief-taker's financial incentive was the bounty, not the outcome. Whether the accused was actually guilty was secondary to whether a prosecution would produce the reward. The McDaniel gang, operating in the 1750s, recruited men into crimes they had themselves designed, then turned them in to collect the payment and watched innocent men hang. No mechanism in the system could distinguish between a thief-taker and a crime boss. The difference was personal ethics, and personal ethics proved unreliable when the price was right. By 1800, recorded crime in London stood at roughly 5,000 incidents per year. By the early 1830s, that number had climbed to nearly 20,000. London's population had grown from 1 million to approaching 1.5 million. The city had 4,500 night watchmen and a few hundred constables who were, in the words of the National Archives documentation on this period, generally seen as corrupt, inefficient, and jealous of one another's powers. Henry Fielding had written in 1752 that the London mob was so powerful it controlled who could walk the streets. 80 years later, the situation had not improved. It had scaled. Someone had to do something. The question was whether Parliament would pay for it. In 1822, a former Irish secretary named Robert Peel became Home Secretary of the United Kingdom. He had spent years in Dublin observing what a centrally organized, professionally paid police force could accomplish. He had also watched London degenerate into a city where the mechanisms for enforcing order were a patchwork of competing, incompetent, and frequently criminal entities answering to no single authority. A Commons inquiry in 1822 formally documented the failure. Another in 1828 reached the same conclusion and called explicitly for reform. On September 29, 1829, 1,000 constables in blue uniforms stepped onto the streets of London. The color was chosen deliberately. Red was the color of the military, and England had a deep institutional fear of the army being turned against its own citizens. Blue signaled civilian authority. These men were not soldiers. They were, Peel insisted, citizens in uniform, accountable to the public they served and to the Home Secretary above them, not to local interests or personal profit. The Metropolitan Police Act of 1829 replaced the Statute of Winchester, which had been the primary legislation governing English policing since 1285, a statute that had governed law enforcement for 544 years was made obsolete in a single parliamentary session. What replaced it was specific in its departures from everything that had come before. Officers were paid a salary, 21 shillings a week, slightly above a laborer's wage. They could not collect personal bounties. Their financial interest was severed from the commission of crime, which was the structural flaw that had destroyed every version of the thief-taker system. They walked fixed beats so the public knew where they were. They were forbidden from entering public houses, from associating with known criminals, from carrying firearms. They were given wooden truncheons. The signal was unmistakable. These men had authority, but it was bounded authority, civilian authority, operating with the consent of the people they patrolled. Peel's 9 principles for policing, articulated in the Act, stated plainly that the ability of the police to perform their duties depended on public approval of their existence. That premise had no equivalent in anything that had come before it. Wergild had required community approval to collect. The Frank Pledge had required community participation to function. The hue and cry had required neighbors willing to run. But none of those systems had been built around the consent of the person being policed. They had been built around the obligation of the community to enforce itself. Parliament resisted. Many members genuinely feared that a professional police force was the first step toward tyranny, toward the military model that England had spent centuries resisting. Peel navigated this by making the design of the force legible at a glance. Civilian clothes, no weapons, fixed geography, public accountability. Within 5 years, recorded property crime in central London had measurably declined. Within 3 decades, every major city in Britain had followed the model. Within 50 years, the English-speaking world had been reorganized around a premise that had not existed before 1829, that enforcing the law was the permanent, full-time, salaried responsibility of the state, not the private obligation of the victim. The Statute of Winchester had stood since 1285. Before that, the Frank Pledge had run from the time of King Aethelstan. Before that, the blood feud had been the law of every civilization that existed without a third-party enforcer. Robert Peel did not invent the police. He invented the idea that the state owed you one. But here is what every system in this story had in common. From the blood feud, to the Frank Pledge, to the thief-taker, to Peel's constables on their fixed beats. They were built by men for the protection of property and the honor of families. Every mechanism this script has described, Wergild included, assumed a particular kind of victim, a person embedded in a community, a person with kin, a person whose loss registered as a loss to someone with standing to demand compensation. Go back to the beginning. The price of a man. That is what Wergild meant, literally. Not the price of a person, not the price of a life, the price of a man. The scale ran from nobleman to free farmer to laborer to slave, and the legal value of each life descended accordingly. A noblewoman's Wergild existed, but legal historians have documented what it actually represented. Not the price of her life, but the price of the insult to her male kin. Harming her was an offense against them. She was not the legal party with standing to demand compensation. Her family was. If she had no family, or if her family had no standing, the law had no price for her at all. The Digital Panopticon, which documents criminal procedure in England from 1780 onward, states explicitly that sexual predation and domestic violence were largely unprosecuted before the mid-19th century. Not underreported. Unprosecuted. The system did not fail to capture these crimes. It did not classify them as crimes to begin with. The hue and cry obligated your neighbors to chase a thief. It did not obligate them to intervene in what happened inside a house. Henry Fielding's Covent Garden Journal in 1752 described the London mob as controlling who could walk the streets. The people most directly controlled by that mob were women walking alone, the poor unable to pay a thief-taker, and the displaced with no tithing, no oath helpers, and no family to raise the cry on their behalf. These were not edge cases. They were the majority of London's population. Peel's 1829 recruitment criteria for constables required candidates to be male, under 35, physically fit, and at least 5 feet 7 inches tall. The National Archives documentation on early Metropolitan Police recruitment does not record any category for victim type, but the history of who was and was not taken seriously by the new constables follows a pattern continuous with everything that preceded them. The mechanism changed. The hierarchy of whose suffering counted did not change with equal speed. Wergild had encoded that hierarchy in law for centuries. Different prices for different lives, openly stated, mathematically precise. The system that replaced it encoded the same hierarchy in practice without stating it openly. In some ways, the explicit version was more honest. The price of a man was at least legible. you could read exactly where you stood. The question the title asks is not only what replaced violence before police existed, it is whose violence the system was designed to stop. Return for a moment to the woman with the stolen candlesticks, the one who walked to Jonathan Wild's office in 1718 and paid him a fee and did not ask where her property had been. Under Peel's Metropolitan Police, she does not need Wild. She walks to the constable on his fixed beat 2 streets away. She reports the theft. He takes a description. There is no fee. There is no negotiation with the man who arranged the theft. The system she enters is imperfect, underfunded, and staffed by men working 7 days a week for 21 shillings. But she does not owe it anything. It owes her something. That is the change. That is the entire change. Before 1829, the answer to violence was violence held in reserve by your family, or a price placed on the dead, or a shout into the street that obligated your neighbors to run, or a private arrangement with a man who might be the criminal himself. Each system worked for those it was designed to serve. Each collapsed under the weight of a world larger and more complicated than the community it assumed. The blood feud was deterrence built on fear. Wergild was negotiation built on price. The Frank Pledge was surveillance built on shared obligation. The thief-taker was justice built on profit. Every one of them failed in the same direction, toward the margins, away from the center, leaving behind everyone who could not pay or fight or shout loud enough to be heard. Robert Peel did not solve that problem in 1829. He changed its shape. He moved enforcement from the victim to the state and made the state at least theoretically accountable for the result. Whether the state delivered on that accountability is a different story and a longer one. If you know of any civilization outside England that independently developed something like the Wergild system, a formal price placed on a human life to stop a cycle of violence, I would genuinely like to know which one. Leave it in the comments. The independent convergence on this idea across cultures that had no contact with each other is one of the most striking things in this entire history. If this is the kind of question you find yourself unable to stop thinking about once someone puts it in front of you, there are more of them here. Subscribing means you will not miss the next one.